April 24, 2004. Manhattan lies wrapped in the quiet of early spring. The trees along the Upper East Side have begun to bud, their branches tracing pale lines against the gray stone facades of some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. On East 70th Street between Madison and Park Avenue, a limestone townhouse stands in practiced silence. 5 stories, Beaux-Arts detailing, a wrought iron balcony on the second floor overlooking a street that has witnessed the comings and goings of American royalty for more than a century. Inside this house, a woman is dying. She is 97 years old. She has not been seen in public for nearly 5 years. The world that once hung on her every word, that studied her gestures and copied her mannerisms, has largely moved on to newer obsessions. But her name remains everywhere, on bottles and jars, on the facades of department stores, in the medicine cabinets of women across 6 continents. Estée Lauder, a name that is not quite the name she was born with, a life that is not quite the life she lived. The official cause of death will be recorded as cardiopulmonary arrest, a natural end to a natural life. The family will release a brief statement. The obituaries will be respectful, admiring, carefully constructed, much like the woman herself. The New York Times will call her a grande dame of the cosmetics industry. The Wall Street Journal will note that she built a company worth billions from nothing more than a few jars of face cream and an unshakable belief in her own destiny. But even in death, there are silences. The obituaries will repeat the origin story she spent decades perfecting. The daughter of Hungarian immigrants, raised in Queens, a self-made woman who clawed her way from obscurity to magnificence through sheer will and superior product. They will mention her famous persistence, her habit of touching women's faces uninvited, her genius for making every customer feel like the only woman in the room. What they will not mention, because they do not know or do not wish to say, is how much of this story was invention. They will not mention that her birth certificate tells a different tale than the one she told, that her accent was cultivated, not inherited, that her aristocratic bearing was a performance begun so early and maintained so consistently that it became indistinguishable from truth. They will not mention that even her closest associates, even perhaps her own children, never knew exactly where the real woman ended and the creation began. The townhouse on East 70th Street was the final stage for this performance. She purchased it in the 1980s, when she was already in her 70s, but still very much in command of her company, of her image, of the narrative that surrounded her like expensive perfume. The house became a kind of temple, not to wealth, though wealth was evident in every surface and object, not to beauty, though beauty was the product she sold, but to the idea of Estée Lauder herself, the woman who had willed herself into existence. Now, in the spring of 2004, that woman lies in a bedroom on one of the upper floors, attended by nurses and surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a lifetime spent in relentless acquisition. The blue and white Chinese porcelain she collected obsessively, the French furniture she insisted was the only furniture worth owning, the photographs in silver frames, Estée with duchesses, with presidents, with movie stars who sought her advice on how to be more beautiful, more desirable, more worthy of attention. Outside, Manhattan continues its indifferent rhythm. Taxis pass. A doorman at the building across the street checks his watch. In the townhouse, the silence deepens. She will be buried in a private ceremony. The family will ask for privacy, and they will receive it. The company she built will continue without her, guided by sons and grandsons and an army of executives who learned at her knee. The townhouse will pass into other hands eventually, as all houses do, but something will linger in its rooms, something that resists easy explanation. Because the woman who died on that April morning was in some fundamental sense unknowable. She had made herself unknowable. She had taken the raw material of a girl from Queens, a girl with an immigrant father and uncertain prospects, and transformed it into something that belonged in this townhouse, on this street, in this rarefied world. The transformation was so complete so total that to examine it too closely felt almost indecent, like lifting the lid on a magician's box. What was real? What was constructed? Where did ambition end and identity begin? The obituaries would not ask these questions. The family certainly would not. The industry she dominated for half a century would simply continue selling dreams in elegant packaging, dreams that she herself had been the first and most successful to embody. But the questions remain. They hang in the air of that townhouse like the ghost of a perfume worn long ago. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. Corona, Queens, 1908, or perhaps 1906. The records are unclear, and Estée Lauder would spend a lifetime ensuring they remained so. The neighborhood was a patchwork of immigrants, Italians, Jews from Eastern Europe, Irish families who had arrived a generation earlier and now looked down on the newer arrivals. The streets smelled of horse manure and coal smoke. Laundry hung from fire escapes. Children played in the gutters, while their mothers haggled with pushcart vendors in a babel of accents. On a street not far from the elevated train tracks, a hardware store occupied the ground floor of a modest building. Above it lived the Menzer family. Max Menzer, the father, had come from Hungary with little more than the clothes on his back and a determination to make something of himself in America. He sold nails and hammers and lengths of rope. He was not a dreamer. He was a man who understood the value of a day's work and the danger of wanting too much. His daughter did not inherit this caution. She was born Josephine Esther Menzer. Though she would later claim the name Estée was a childhood nickname, a diminutive of Esther rendered in some vaguely European fashion. The truth, like so much about her early life, remains difficult to verify. What is certain is that from her earliest years, the girl who would become Estée Lauder understood that she did not belong in Corona, Queens. Not because she had been told this, not because anyone had promised her something better, but because something inside her refused to accept the life that circumstance had assigned. Her mother, Rose, had also come from Hungary. She had been married before, had children from that earlier union, had known loss and displacement, and the particular exhaustion of immigrant women who must remake their lives in a strange country. Rose was practical. Rose was tired. Rose did not have time for a daughter who spent hours staring at her own reflection, who asked too many questions about the ladies she saw in magazine advertisements, who seemed to believe that wanting something badly enough could make it real. But there was someone in the household who did have time. His name was John Schatz. He was Rose's brother, a chemist who had arrived from Hungary and moved into the cramped apartment above the hardware store. He was not a successful man by conventional measures. He did not own a business, or employ workers, or have his name on a building. But he had knowledge. He had formulas. And in a small space that served as a makeshift laboratory, he made creams, face creams, skin creams, preparations that promised to smooth and soften and transform. He called his modest enterprise the New Way Laboratories, a name that suggested ambition far beyond the reality of a few jars mixed in a back room in Queens. But to his young niece, it was magic. She would watch him work for hours. The measuring, the mixing, the careful attention to texture and scent. She learned that beauty was not merely inherited. It could be manufactured. It could be bottled and sold. It could be democratized, made available to any woman willing to pay for it. And more importantly, she learned that transformation was possible. If a few simple ingredients could change a woman's skin, what else might be changed? What limits were truly fixed? The young Esther began experimenting. She would later claim that she started with her own face, applying her uncle's creams with a devotion that bordered on ritual. She studied the results. She refined her techniques. She began to understand that the product alone was not enough. There had to be a story, a promise, a seduction. The cream had to offer more than moisture. It had to offer hope. She also began to understand something else, something that would shape every decision she made for the next 8 decades. She understood that her name was wrong, that her address was wrong, that her father's hardware store and her mother's tired eyes, and the cramped apartment above the shop, all of it was wrong. It marked her as common, as ordinary, as one of the masses who would live and die without ever being truly seen. This she could not accept. Later, when she had become Estée Lauder, when she lived in a townhouse on the Upper East Side and summered in the south of France and counted duchesses among her friends, she would speak of her childhood rarely and carefully. She would imply aristocratic European origins. She would suggest that her family had known refinement, culture, a certain continental elegance that had merely been temporarily obscured by the immigrant experience. She would claim her father had owned not a hardware store, but something more respectable. The details shifted depending on the audience. She was not lying exactly. She was editing. She was doing to her own history what she would later do to women's faces, smoothing, perfecting, removing the imperfections that distracted from the desired effect. But the girl from Corona never entirely disappeared. She remained somewhere beneath the polished surface, watching, remembering, driving the woman forward with a hunger that no amount of success could satisfy. Because the girl from Corona knew something that Estée Lauder could never quite forget. She knew how easily it could all be taken away, how thin the line was between belonging and exclusion, how a single misstep, a single revelation, could send her tumbling back to the apartment above the hardware store, to the smell of coal smoke and the sound of the elevated train, to a life that was never supposed to be hers. This knowledge would make her relentless. It would make her impossible to satisfy. And it would make her, in the end, unknowable even to those who loved her most. In 1930, in the midst of the Great Depression, Josephine Esther Menzer married a man named Joseph Lauder. He was quiet where she was relentless. He was content where she was hungry. He came from a similar background, Jewish, immigrant family, modest circumstances. But he did not share her burning need to escape it. He sold textiles. He worked hard. He expected a conventional life. He did not know what he had married. Within a few years, she had already begun to change him. The name came first. Lauder became Lauder, a small alteration that she insisted made the name sound more refined, more French, more appropriate for the destiny she was constructing. Joseph went along with it. He would go along with many things over the decades that followed, watching with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment as his wife transformed herself into someone he barely recognized. They had a son, Leonard, in 1933. The responsibilities of motherhood did nothing to slow her. If anything, they intensified her determination. She would not raise her children in the cramped circumstances she had known. She would not watch them grow up with the smell of a hardware store in their clothes, with the sound of the elevated train marking the boundaries of their world. She began selling, not in a shop, she could not afford a shop, but in beauty salons, in hotel lobbies, wherever women gathered. She would approach them directly, a jar of her uncle's cream in her hand, and before they could refuse, she would touch their faces. It was audacious. It was borderline inappropriate, and it worked. The touch was her secret weapon. In an era when cosmetics were sold across counters, when sales clerks maintained a professional distance, Estée Lauder put her hands on women's skin. She smoothed cream onto their cheeks. She looked into their eyes. She made them feel seen in a way they had never been seen before, not as customers, but as women worthy of transformation. "I have something that will change your life," she would say. And somehow, when she said it, they believed her. But the marriage could not withstand the pressure of her ambition. In 1939, Estée and Joseph divorced. She had outgrown him, or thought she had. She wanted more than he could give. She wanted society, connections, a world beyond the textile business, and the modest apartment they shared. She dated other men. She tasted what it might mean to move in different circles. It was not enough. 3 years later, in 1942, she remarried Joseph Lauder. The reasons remain obscure. Perhaps she realized that his steadiness was an asset, not a limitation. Perhaps she understood that building an empire required a partner who would not compete with her, who would handle the details she found tedious while she focused on the vision. Perhaps beneath the relentless ambition, there was something simpler, a recognition that he understood her in ways no one else could. Whatever the reason, the remarriage marked a turning point. Together they founded Estée Lauder Inc. in 1946. The company began with 4 products: a cleansing oil, a skin lotion, a face cream, and a powder. They were good products, her uncle's formulas, refined and improved, but good products were not enough. The market was crowded with good products. Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein had been fighting their famous war for decades, dividing the luxury cosmetics world between them. Estée Lauder did not intend to fight for scraps, she intended to conquer. Her strategy was simple and ruthless. She would not advertise, not at first. Advertising cost money she did not have, and besides, advertising was impersonal. Instead, she would rely on the touch. She would train saleswomen to approach customers directly, to put cream on their faces, to create an experience that no advertisement could replicate. And she would give gifts. The gift with purchase was her invention, or at least her perfection. Buy a lipstick, receive a sample of face cream. The sample would create desire. The desire would create a customer. The customer would create another customer, through word of mouth, through the quiet evangelism of women who had found something that worked. In 1948, she achieved what should have been impossible. She convinced Saks Fifth Avenue to stock her products. The account was small at first, a single counter, a modest order. But it was Saks. It was Fifth Avenue. It was the legitimacy she had been pursuing her entire life. She stood behind that counter herself in the early days. She touched faces. She told women they were beautiful. She sold. The expansion was relentless. Neiman Marcus, Bonwit Teller, Harrods in London, every prestige department store in America, and then the world. By the mid-1950s, Estée Lauder was no longer a small company with a single counter. It was an empire in formation. And then came Youth Dew. In 1953, she introduced a bath oil that doubled as a perfume. It was not marketed as fragrance. Fragrance was something men bought for women, a gift, an occasion. Youth Dew was something a woman could buy for herself, a small luxury, a daily indulgence. The scent was warm, amber, persistent. It clung to the skin for hours. It announced presence. Women did not buy one bottle. They bought dozens over the years, using it every day, making it part of their identity. Youth Dew became one of the best-selling fragrances in history, and it transformed Estée Lauder from a successful cosmetics company into something much larger, a cultural force. But success at this scale exacted a price. She was everywhere. She controlled everything. The color of the packaging, the wording of the advertisements, the placement of products on department store counters, the training of every saleswoman. She trusted no one to understand her vision as well as she did. She could not delegate, could not rest, could not accept that anything less than perfection was acceptable. Her family watched. Her sons grew up in the shadow of her ambition, groomed to continue what she had built, but never quite allowed to make it their own. Her husband managed the operations, the numbers, the logistics, while she remained the face, the voice, the driving force. And somewhere beneath the triumphs, a question began to form, a question no one dared to ask aloud. What would happen when she could no longer control it all? The Upper East Side of Manhattan has always understood the language of architecture. Every cornice, every limestone facade, every wrought iron railing speaks of money, but more than money, of belonging. The buildings on these streets do not merely house the wealthy, they certify them. They announce, in a grammar older than the Republic, that the people who live behind these walls are not merely rich, they are permanent. Estée Lauder understood this language fluently. She had studied it for decades, walking these streets as a younger woman, noting which houses belonged to which families, learning the subtle hierarchies that distinguished old money from new, the merely affluent from the truly arrived. She understood that in New York, address was destiny, and she intended to claim the right address. The townhouse on East 70th Street, between Madison and Park Avenues, was not her first Manhattan residence. She had lived in apartments, in increasingly prestigious buildings, climbing the ladder of real estate as deliberately as she had climbed every other ladder in her life. But an apartment, however grand, was still an apartment. It meant shared lobbies, shared elevators, neighbors who might judge or gossip or, worst of all, remember where you came from. A townhouse was different. A townhouse was sovereignty. She acquired the property in the 1980s, when she was already in her 70s, but still very much in command of her empire and her image. The building itself dated from the early 20th century, one of the Beaux-Arts limestone structures that defined the neighborhood's character. 5 stories, approximately 15,000 square feet. A facade that whispered rather than shouted, confident in its own importance. The previous owners do not matter. What matters is what she made of it. The renovation was extensive. Estée Lauder did not purchase houses to live in them as they were. She purchased them to transform them, just as she transformed faces, just as she had transformed herself. Every detail required her approval. Every fabric, every finish, every piece of furniture had to meet standards that existed fully formed in her mind, standards she could not always articulate, but always recognized when she saw them. The palette was cream and gold, soft blues and muted greens, colors that suggested old European nobility, the kind of aristocratic refinement she had spent her life claiming as her birthright. The furniture was French, 18th century or convincing reproductions, the sort of pieces that belonged in palaces. She collected obsessively Chinese export porcelain, crystal chandeliers, silver that required a staff to maintain. But the townhouse was not merely a repository for beautiful objects, it was a stage. She entertained constantly. Dinners for 30, luncheons for society women, gatherings that brought together the famous and the powerful in rooms designed to impress even those who had seen everything. The guest lists were curated with the same precision she applied to her product lines. Duchesses and CEOs, fashion editors, and museum directors. Anyone who mattered, anyone who could confirm that Estée Lauder belonged exactly where she was. The dining room could seat 24 beneath a chandelier that had reportedly hung in a European palace. The drawing rooms were arranged for conversation, for the careful exchange of gossip and favors that constituted social currency at this altitude. The library held books that may or may not have been read, but whose leather bindings contributed to the atmosphere of cultivated permanence. And everywhere photographs, silver-framed images documenting her ascent. Estée with royalty, Estée with presidents, Estée receiving honors, attending galas, standing in the centers of rooms full of people who had once looked down on women like her. The photographs were not merely decorative. They were evidence. They were proof against anyone who might question whether she truly belonged. Her bedroom on one of the upper floors was a sanctuary within the sanctuary. Here the decoration was softer, more personal, though no less considered. Here she could retreat from the performance, though it is unclear whether the performance ever truly stopped, even in private. Even alone, she was Estée Lauder. The role had become indistinguishable from the woman. The staff moved through the house like ghosts, discreet, efficient, trained to anticipate needs before they were expressed. There were housekeepers and cooks, personal assistants and drivers. An infrastructure of service that made the performance possible, that maintained the illusion of effortless elegance while concealing the immense effort required to sustain it. From the windows of the upper floors, she could see the rooftops of Manhattan stretching toward the park. This view, this address, this house, they represented everything she had worked for since those early days in Corona, watching her uncle mix creams in a makeshift laboratory. She had escaped. She had arrived. She had made herself into someone who belonged on East 70th Street, someone whose name would be remembered long after the hardware store and the immigrant origins had been forgotten. But houses hold more than furniture and art. They hold time. They hold the accumulation of days lived within their walls, the slow accretion of memory and meaning. And as the years passed, as Estée Lauder grew older and began to withdraw from the public life she had cultivated so carefully, the townhouse began to change. It became less a stage and more a refuge. The dinner parties grew less frequent. The guest lists grew shorter. The rooms that had once buzzed with conversation fell quiet. She was still there, still in command, but her world was contracting. The empire she had built continued to expand. New products, new markets, new billions. But she was no longer at its center. Her sons had taken over. The company had outgrown its founder. And in the townhouse on East 70th Street, a woman who had spent her life in motion found herself at last unable to escape the stillness. The walls that had witnessed her triumphs would soon witness something else entirely. The decline began so gradually that it was almost imperceptible. A missed appearance here, a delegated responsibility there. The woman who had once insisted on controlling every detail of her empire began, slowly, to loosen her grip. The late 1990s, Estée Lauder was in her late 80s, still formidable, still capable of commanding a room with her presence. But those who knew her well, and truly knowing her was always a limited privilege, began to notice changes. A momentary confusion in conversation, a name forgotten, then remembered, then forgotten again. The legendary focus, the laser-like attention to detail that had built a billion-dollar company, was beginning to waver. She had always been meticulous about her public image. Every photograph approved, every interview controlled, every appearance choreographed, to reinforce the narrative she had spent decades constructing. Now the appearances grew fewer. The interviews ceased. The woman who had made herself synonymous with her brand began to disappear from it. The company managed the transition with characteristic discretion. Her son Leonard had been running operations for years. Her grandsons were assuming larger roles. The infrastructure was in place to continue without her, as it had been designed to do, but the official communications remained vague. Mrs. Lauder was reducing her schedule. Mrs. Lauder was focusing on private matters. Mrs. Lauder sent her regards. By 1999, she had effectively vanished from public life. The last verified public appearance is difficult to pinpoint. There were sightings, rumors, second-hand accounts. Someone had seen her at a family gathering. Someone had heard she was traveling. Someone claimed she was still sharp, still engaged, still the Estée Lauder they had always known. But the sightings grew rarer, the rumors more contradictory, the silence deeper. What was happening inside the townhouse on East 70th Street? The family did not say. The company did not say. The wall of privacy that had always surrounded her personal life became, in these final years, nearly impenetrable. She had spent a lifetime controlling her narrative. Now, as that control slipped away, the narrative simply stopped. There were whispers, of course. In a world as competitive and gossip-driven as the beauty industry, silence creates speculation. Some said she was suffering from dementia, the cruel disease that erases identity piece by piece. Others said she was merely frail, diminished by age but still herself. Still others suggested she had simply chosen to withdraw, to spend her final years in private, rather than allow the world to see her diminished. The truth, as always with Estée Lauder, remained elusive. Medical records are private. Family conversations are private. What happened inside that townhouse between 1999 and 2004, the slow unwinding of a life that had been lived at such extraordinary velocity, belongs to those who witnessed it. They have chosen, with few exceptions, not to speak. But certain facts can be established. She required increasing care. Nurses attended her around the clock in her final years. The staff that had once facilitated her social triumphs now facilitated something far more intimate, the management of a body and mind in decline. The townhouse that had been built for entertaining became a kind of luxurious hospital, its beautiful rooms repurposed for medical equipment and round-the-clock observation. Her husband Joseph had died in 1983, more than 2 decades earlier. Whatever companionship that relationship had provided, and by all accounts, despite its complications, it had provided genuine partnership, was long gone. Her sons visited, her grandchildren visited, but the woman they visited was, by many accounts, no longer entirely the woman they had known. This is the particular cruelty of cognitive decline. It does not merely take away memory, it takes away self. The carefully constructed identity that Estée Lauder had spent 90 years building, the accent, the bearing, the absolute certainty of her own belonging, began to dissolve. What remained when the performance could no longer be sustained? Who was she when she could no longer remember who she had decided to be? These questions have no answers, or rather, their answers died with her. April 24, 2004. The date is certain. The cause of death, cardiopulmonary arrest, is a matter of public record. She was 97 years old. She had outlived most of her contemporaries, most of her rivals, most of the people who remembered the girl from Corona before she became the legend of Fifth Avenue. The family released a statement. The obituaries were written. The tributes poured in from the industries she had dominated, from the society she had conquered, from women around the world who had never met her, but felt they knew her through the products that bore her name. But beneath the official narrative, questions lingered. Why had she disappeared so completely in her final years? Other aging icons had managed their declines more publicly, had allowed the world to witness their diminishment as a final act of authenticity. Estée Lauder had chosen, or someone had chosen for her, total invisibility. Was this her final act of control? Or had control already passed to others? What had she said in those final years, when the filters of a lifetime began to fail? Had she spoken of Corona, of the hardware store, of the life she had worked so hard to escape? Had she revealed, in moments of confusion, truths she had spent decades concealing? And if so, who had heard them? What had they done with the knowledge? The townhouse kept its secrets, the family kept theirs, and the woman who had built an empire on the promise of transformation had undergone her final transformation. From legend to memory, from presence to absence, from the relentless force that had shaped an industry to a name on a building, a signature on a bottle, a ghost in a limestone house on East 70th Street. The official story was complete. But official stories, as Estée Lauder knew better than anyone, are never the whole truth. They are merely the version we choose to tell. Begin with the birth certificate. It should be a simple document, a record of fact, indisputable. But even here, at the very foundation of her story, the contradictions emerge. Official records suggest she was born in 1908. Estée Lauder herself, throughout her life, implied various dates, 1906, 1908, sometimes vaguer formulations that allowed listeners to draw their own conclusions. The discrepancy is small, perhaps trivial, but it establishes a pattern. From the very beginning, the facts of her life were negotiable. Her name underwent similar revisions. Josephine Esther Menzer became Estée Lauder through a series of transformations that she narrated differently depending on the audience. The Estée was a childhood nickname, she sometimes said. A French variation of Esther, an affectation that became permanent. The Lauder was simply a refinement of Lauder, her husband's name, a single letter changed to suggest something more elegant, more European, more appropriate for the woman she intended to become. These are small alterations. Many immigrants and children of immigrants have anglicized their names, adjusted their histories, smoothed the rough edges of their origins. But Estée Lauder did not merely adjust, she constructed. And she defended her constructions with a ferocity that suggested something more than vanity was at stake. When a journalist in the 1980s attempted to research her early life, she threatened legal action. When biographers sought to document her origins, they found doors closed, records obscured, family members unwilling to speak. The company's official materials repeated the narrative she had approved, and deviation from that narrative was treated as something approaching betrayal. Why such vigilance? What was she protecting? One interpretation is simple pride. She had built herself from nothing, and she did not wish to be reminded of that nothing. The hardware store in Corona, the cramped apartment, the immigrant struggle, these were not elements of the story she wished to tell. They contradicted the image of effortless aristocratic grace she had cultivated so carefully. But another interpretation suggests something deeper. Perhaps the construction was so complete, so total, that any crack in the facade threatened the entire structure. If one fact could be questioned, all facts could be questioned. If one lie could be exposed, the whole edifice of Estée Lauder, not merely the woman, but the brand, the company, the legend, might be revealed as performance rather than reality. She performed even for those closest to her. Her sons, Leonard and Ronald, grew up inside the narrative. They were raised to be Lauders, heirs to a dynasty their mother had invented. What did they know of Corona, of the hardware store, of the girl their mother had been before she became who she decided to be? The family has never said. The family has maintained across decades a discipline of silence that mirrors their matriarch's own. This silence extended to her final years with particular intensity. Between 1999 and 2004, 5 years of near-total invisibility, the public received almost no information about Estée Lauder's condition. Industry observers noted her absence. Society columnists speculated. But the family offered nothing beyond the vaguest assurances that she was well, or resting, or enjoying privacy. In an age of increasing transparency, when the health of public figures is routinely discussed and documented, this opacity was remarkable. Other cosmetics titans had aged publicly. Elizabeth Arden had worked until her death at 78, her decline witnessed by the industry. Helena Rubinstein had remained visible into her 90s, her imperious presence documented until the end. Estée Lauder simply vanished. The questions multiply. Who made the decision to withdraw her from public life? Was it her own choice, made while she still possessed the capacity to choose? Or did others, family members, advisors, handlers, determine that invisibility was preferable to the alternative? If she suffered from cognitive decline, as the circumstantial evidence suggests, at what point did she cease to be the author of her own story? And who took up the pen when she laid it down? The townhouse on East 70th Street became, in those years, a kind of sealed chamber. Staff came and went, bound no doubt by confidentiality agreements. Medical professionals attended her, their observations protected by privacy laws. Family members visited, but what they witnessed, they kept to themselves. The woman who had spent a lifetime making herself known had become, in the end, unknowable by design. Some who worked in the beauty industry during those years recall whispers. A chance encounter with a former employee who had heard something. A rumor passed at a trade show. A suggestion that all was not as it seemed, that the silence concealed something the family did not wish known. But whispers are not evidence. Rumors are not facts. And the Lauder family's legal and financial resources ensured that speculation remained speculation. The obituaries, when they came in April 2004, were notably lacking in detail about her final years. They celebrated her achievements. They recounted the approved narrative of her rise. They noted her philanthropic contributions, her social triumphs, her transformation of an industry. But of the woman who had lived in that townhouse for the past half-decade, of what she had experienced and who she had become, they said almost nothing. This absence is itself a kind of statement. It says, the story we told is the story that matters. It says, the woman we presented to the world is the woman who existed. It says, do not look behind the curtain. Do not ask what we have not chosen to reveal. Do not disturb the careful construction of a legacy that depends on controlled information. But silence, in the end, speaks. It speaks of things too precious, or too dangerous to expose to scrutiny. It speaks of a family that understood, perhaps better than anyone, the power of narrative and the necessity of protecting it at all costs. What was the cost? And who paid it? The funeral was private. The family requested that detail be emphasized in every announcement, every press release, every communication with the media that had covered Estée Lauder's rise for half a century. Private. The word itself, a kind of wall, a final boundary erected around a woman who had spent her life erecting boundaries between the self she presented and the self she concealed. She was buried at Beth David Cemetery in Elmont, New York. The location held a certain quiet irony. Elmont lies in Nassau County, Long Island, not far in the geography of New York, from Corona, Queens, where she had begun. The girl from the apartment above the hardware store had traveled an immense distance in her 97 years. But in death, she returned to the orbit of her origins, laid to rest in a Jewish cemetery among the graves of other immigrants and their descendants, other strivers who had come to America seeking transformation. The company she built did not pause for grief. Estée Lauder Inc. was, by 2004, a publicly traded corporation with annual revenues exceeding $5 billion. It employed thousands of people across dozens of countries. It owned brands she had never created: Clinique, MAC, Bobbi Brown, Aveda, each acquired as the empire expanded beyond anything she could have imagined in those early days at the Saks counter. The machinery of commerce continued to turn, indifferent to the death of its founder. Leonard Lauder, her elder son, had been the architect of much of this expansion. He had served as CEO for decades, had overseen the company's transformation from a family business into a global conglomerate. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that his mother's genius lay not merely in products, but in narrative, in the story of Estée Lauder, the self-made woman, the immigrant's daughter who conquered Fifth Avenue, and then the world. That narrative would continue. It had to continue. Too much depended on it. The tributes poured in. Industry publications dedicated pages to her legacy. Executives who had known her, or claimed to have known her, shared carefully worded remembrances. She was a pioneer. She was a visionary. She was the woman who taught America how to dream. The language was reverent, almost hagiographic. It permitted no complexity, no shadow, no suggestion that the woman being mourned was anything other than the legend she had constructed. But within the family, the dynamics were more complicated. Estée Lauder had maintained control for so long, had been so central to the company's identity, that her absence created a kind of vacuum. Not in operations. Leonard and his team had managed operations for years. But in meaning. What was Estée Lauder Inc. without Estée Lauder? A corporation like any other? A collection of brands and balance sheets? Or something more, a living continuation of one woman's impossible will? The family closed ranks. They had always been private, but after her death, the privacy intensified. Interviews were rare and carefully controlled. Biographers who sought access found none. The archive of her personal papers, her correspondence, her private records, whatever existed, remained sealed. The family understood that the legend required protection, and they provided it with the same discipline their matriarch had demanded. Her philanthropic legacy offered a more public face. The Lauder family had given generously to museums, to medical research, to Jewish causes, to educational institutions. These gifts bore her name, ensured its perpetuation on buildings and programs, and endowed chairs. The Estée Lauder Company's charitable foundation continued her tradition of corporate giving. In this way, the name remained visible, associated with generosity and civic virtue, even as the woman herself receded into history. But history has a way of complicating legends. In the years following her death, scholars and journalists occasionally attempted to pierce the veil she had constructed. They found fragments, a birth certificate that contradicted her preferred chronology. Census records that placed her family in contexts she had never acknowledged. Interviews with distant relatives who remembered a different story than the one she told. These fragments never coalesced into a definitive counter-narrative. The family's resources and vigilance ensured that the official story remained dominant. But the fragments existed. They circulated in academic papers, in footnotes, in the whispered knowledge of those who study the construction of American success. The company itself continued to thrive. New generations of Lauders assumed leadership roles. New brands were acquired. New markets opened. The beauty industry that Estée Lauder had helped to shape continued to evolve, embracing new technologies, new aesthetics, new definitions of beauty that she might not have recognized. But her name remained on the door. Her signature remained on the packaging. Her legend remained the foundation on which everything else was built. And in Manhattan, on a quiet street between Madison and Park, a limestone townhouse stood as it had always stood. The family retained ownership for years after her death. It was too significant to sell, too saturated with memory and meaning. The rooms where she had entertained duchesses, the bedroom where she had spent her final years, the windows from which she had surveyed the city she had conquered, all of it remained in Lauder hands, maintained by Lauder staff, protected by Lauder privacy. But houses, unlike legends, cannot be maintained indefinitely. They require decisions. They demand, eventually, to be either inhabited or released. The townhouse waited, holding its silence, holding its secrets, holding the ghost of a woman who had built herself from nothing and left behind an empire that no longer needed her. Real estate in Manhattan exists in a state of perpetual transformation. Buildings rise and fall. Fortunes change hands. The city consumes its own history with an appetite that would horrify older civilizations, erasing and rebuilding with a speed that makes permanence an illusion. Only certain addresses resist this relentless metabolism. Only certain houses endure. The townhouse on East 70th Street was one of these. For years after Estée Lauder's death, the property remained in the family's possession. It was not listed for sale. It did not appear in the real estate pages that chronicle the movements of Manhattan's elite. It simply existed, maintained and protected, a private monument to a private woman. What happened inside during those years is unknown. Perhaps family members used it for gatherings, for the continuation of traditions she had established. Perhaps it stood largely empty, visited occasionally by staff who ensured that the chandeliers remained polished and the porcelain remained dusted. Perhaps her personal effects remained in place, the photographs in silver frames, the French furniture, the accumulated evidence of a lifetime of acquisition, preserved as she had left them, a kind of shrine to absence. The Lauder family has never spoken publicly about the townhouse's fate in the years immediately following her death. This silence is consistent with their broader approach to privacy, their understanding that some things are not meant for public consumption. The house that had been a stage for her social triumphs became, in death, simply a house, a piece of property held by a family wealthy enough to hold it indefinitely, for reasons they did not need to explain. But eventually, all houses find new purposes. The Upper East Side townhouse market exists in its own rarefied atmosphere. Properties of this caliber trade hands rarely, and when they do, the transactions often occur privately, away from the scrutiny of the press. Buyers at this level value discretion. They do not wish to be photographed entering their new acquisitions. They do not wish to be profiled in lifestyle magazines. They wish simply to live or to own, which is not always the same thing. When properties like the Lauder townhouse do change hands, they carry with them a weight that newer constructions cannot replicate. They offer not merely square footage and location, but history, provenance, the knowledge that someone significant lived and died within these walls, that the rooms have witnessed moments that mattered. For certain buyers, this history is the point. They are not purchasing a house, they are purchasing a connection to something larger than themselves. But history is a complicated inheritance. The new owners of such properties must decide what to do with the ghosts. Some choose renovation, stripping the interiors to the studs, erasing every trace of the previous occupants, creating blank spaces onto which they can project their own identities. Others choose preservation, maintaining the rooms as they were, living among the furniture and objects of the dead, accepting a kind of cohabitation with memory. What choice was made for the Lauder townhouse? The public record offers little clarity. The house does not announce itself. It does not invite scrutiny. It remains, as it has always been, a facade of practiced discretion on a street full of practiced discretion, revealing nothing to those who pass by. And yet the house persists in cultural memory, even if that memory is imprecise. It appears in profiles of the Lauder family, mentioned as the matriarch's final residence. It surfaces in architectural discussions of Upper East Side townhouses, cited as an example of Beaux-Arts elegance. It exists as a point on the map of New York wealth, a landmark in the geography of American success. For those who know its history, walking past the house produces a particular sensation. Here is where she lived. Here is where she held court, where she entertained the powerful and the beautiful, where she performed the role she had spent a lifetime perfecting. Here is where she withdrew, when the performance could no longer be sustained. Here is where she died. The limestone facade offers no acknowledgement of this history. The windows reveal nothing. The wrought iron balcony on the second floor, where perhaps she once stood surveying her domain, remains empty. The house keeps its secrets as she kept hers, completely, professionally, with a discipline that outlasts death. New stories accumulate. New occupants live their lives within these walls, creating their own memories, their own meanings. The rooms that once held Estée Lauder's carefully curated existence now hold someone else's existence, someone else's aspirations and anxieties and daily rituals. The house adapts. The house endures. The house forgets, or pretends to forget, or holds its memories so deep that they become indistinguishable from the structure itself. But late at night, when the street falls quiet and the lights in the windows dim, something of her remains. Not a ghost in any literal sense. She was too practical, too focused on the material world, to believe in such things. But an imprint, a presence. The residue of a will so powerful that it shaped not only a life, but an industry, a family, a name that will be spoken long after the woman who bore it has been reduced to photographs and anecdotes. The townhouse stands. The city churns around it. And somewhere in those rooms, between the walls that witnessed her triumphs and her diminishment, the question she spent a lifetime avoiding still lingers. Who was she really? And did even she know the answer? Time passes. Memory fades. The sharp edges of a life become soft, indistinct, worn smooth by the handling of generations who never knew the living woman. Estée Lauder exists now as a name on a bottle, a signature reproduced millions of times, a brand that has long since outgrown its origins. The girl from Corona, the woman who touched strangers' faces, the hostess who entertained duchesses in a limestone townhouse, all of these have collapsed into a single image, a single story, a legend polished until it gleams. But legends are not people. They do not contain contradictions. They do not lie awake at night wondering if they will be discovered, if the construction will collapse, if the girl from the hardware store will emerge from behind the mask of the society matron. Legends are finished, complete, safe. The townhouse on East 70th Street remains, stone and glass and iron, indifferent to interpretation. It has witnessed what it has witnessed. It holds what it holds. And it will continue to stand long after the last person who remembers her voice, her touch, her particular way of entering a room has also turned to memory. Some houses outlive their secrets. This one simply keeps them.